There are very few guitar amps in the world that can boast as many players and as many recordings as the Fender Twin Reverb. Amps in general, clean amps notwithstanding. This is, in my opinion, the king of the clean amps, and we're going to talk about why this is one of my favorite amplifiers that's ever existed. We're going to dive right in with some tones here. Please follow the link below where you can listen to some music and hear some of these guitars and amps that I play on some recordings. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. I hope you enjoy. So the Fender Twin Reverb. Now, I had a Twin Reverb years ago and I loved it. Before we go any further, why don't you put in the comments why you think I might have gotten rid of it the first time. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. I'm going to wax poetic here for a moment, and I'm just going to say, when I got this amp recently, I had forgotten what a true joy it is to plug in to this amplifier. As soon as I plugged it in, I knew I had made the right decision, and I felt like I had come home in a way. I just was absolutely in love with the tone. I just sat there playing it for 45 minutes to an hour, just totally engulfed in the tone and totally loving what I was getting from the amp, and it was almost like reuniting with an old friend. Whoa, if you love the Twin Reverb so much, man, I don't know, why don't you two get a room or something? Don't you cheapen it. 90s New York sitcom stereotype guy. So I want to take a minute and say that sometimes I prove myself wrong, and sometimes I dislike when I prove myself wrong. Sometimes I love it. This is one of those cases when I love it. Now, I generally speaking prefer Fender amps with 10-inch speakers. I just think 10-inch speakers suit the Fender amp sound. There are a lot of 12-inch Fender amps that I don't like as much as whatever their closest counterpart is that has some kind of a 10-inch speaker. So, you know, if you're talking about the Deluxe, well, you know, the Deluxe, I prefer the ones on either side. I prefer the Princeton or the Vibrolux. You know, if you're talking about the Hot Rod Deluxe, I prefer the 410 Hot Rod DeVille. Overall, I like the way that the 10-inch speakers focus the Fender amp sound. I've used a Super Reverb for years. I've actually owned Super Reverbs more frequently and had them for more and used them for more than the Twins. And that's just my overall rule, and I would actually say for the most part I'd still agree with that, except to say that I think this one tonally might just be my favorite. It might just be where I feel the most at home. There's something about a Twin Reverb. It is so big and the frequency range is so wide and there's so much depth with the 212s. You ever seen these pictures, these travel pictures of fancy hotel pools that are way up on a cliffside in Greece overlooking the Mediterranean, and there's this like swimming pool with a glass side and then this view of the Mediterranean Sea, and you know, you see someone in slow motion dive into the pool? That's what it's like playing a Twin Reverb. The fact that you can get this lush, powerful sounding reverb with this wide open frequency range and this incredible articulation on your notes, and again, just the way that it rings out, and there's depth to it, there's a 3D quality to it. You can swim in it. It's just absolutely lovely. I'm totally geeking out over it. Now, what is it about the Twin Reverb that made me sell it? I bet a lot of you have guessed it right already. Don't cheat. Come on now. It's heavy. It's a massive, heavy amplifier that is a pain to carry around. And I had one years ago. I had one probably, over 10 years ago. And it was one of my first serious vintage style Fender amps. The other one would be the Bassman. And I love the Bassman, and that's still just on a different kind of level for me. But the Twin I had, and I distinctly remember the first time I got it and I brought it home. A guy that I had done some trading with had one for sale, and I had just sold a guitar, and I thought, you know, it's time for me to pick up a Twin and try using a Twin. And I brought it back to my apartment, and I plugged a Telecaster into it. And as soon as I turned it, the tone was just so natural and so responsive, and so everything that I wanted out of a guitar amp tone. That being said, as much as I loved it, I was playing in more rock bands at the time, and it wasn't the most suited for rock. Not that it can't do rock, I'll talk more about this in a minute, but it really is suited as a clean amp, getting into some overdriven territory. But the reason that I didn't use it was because it was so big and heavy. In the years that I had one before, I took it to exactly 1 gig and 1 studio session. Eventually, I moved on from it. It wasn't suiting what I needed at the time, but part of that is I also just, you know, because our tastes do change and our needs do change and everything, and at the time it just wasn't suiting what I needed. But I also, there's part of me that feels like I was just too immature to understand what I had. And there's probably some truth to both. There was probably some truth to it being smart to move on from it, and some truth to me just not appreciating how good it was at the time. Part of that was because I was looking for a rock amp, and I used various other rock amps over the years and everything, but I always kind of had in the back of my head, should I get another Twin sometime? Oh, I don't know. It just doesn't, you know, well, they're big and heavy. They're so heavy. I'm not going to use it. I'm not going to bring it out places and things. But then I distinctly remember one other time when I was at a guitar store and I plugged into a Twin, and every time I've plugged into a Twin for the first time, I've just had that reaction of going, wow, this just sounds right. This just sounds so good. And so now I'm back and I have the Twin again, and I traded for this one, and this one is going to stay with me. Now, interesting thing is I'm, of course, doing a lot of YouTube right now, and I do a lot of studio recordings and things, and that will be what I primarily use it for. I don't think I'm going to take it out gigging much, again, on account of its size and account of its weight. Now, I know that drummers are going to laugh at you. So one of my drummers at one point over the years tricked me into lugging his hardware bag up a rickety staircase because I didn't know. He said, hey, can you get that for me? Oh, yeah, sure, I'll do. Yeah, you know, no good deed goes unpunished. So everything kind of in context aside, of course, if you're traveling with like a Marshall stack and everything, it's but the Twin Reverb is a beast. It's a heavy, it's one of those amps that when you go to lift it up, for a split second you go, hey, hang on, is this bolted to the floor? Now, there's really one standard way that I run the Twin Reverb, which is interesting because in a lot of amps, I like to tweak them and find different tones and everything, and I think the Twin Reverb is one of those that just does its thing so well. And one of the things that's unique about it is it really brings out the character of the guitar you're playing. This guitar sounds the way this guitar should. The Telecaster sounds the way the Telecaster should. The ES-345 sounds the way that should. You can understand why this is such a popular amp for so many different players. When I say so many different players, you're talking B.B. King, Keith Richards, Steve Jones, Kurt Cobain, the Beatles. And you kind of, at first when you say, oh, B.B. King, Keith Richards, well, wait a second, who were those other guys that you mentioned? Eric Johnson, Steve Howe. The amp can just be used by anyone. And it does get some great tones. Now, the overdriven tone of Twin Reverb is a great tone. I'm not doing it for you. I'm not turning the amp up that loud once. My old one, I turned up to 8 once. And I lived in an apartment building at the time. I didn't live there for very long. But really the point of this amp is this is a clean amp. This is an amp to get you big, powerful, wide open cleans. It can overdrive. It just does it at ridiculous volumes. So that's not really something that you should, even if you're using a power attenuator. I don't know. It's just not an amp that really is. I think this is the clean amp that's out there. Now, I posted this in a Facebook group, a picture of it when I got it, and I mentioned what I am calling this video, the King of Clean. And someone did say, hey, wait a second, there are cleaner amps out there. Somebody mentioned a vintage Hiwatt, someone else mentioned a Roland Jazz Course. And I thought, this is an important point. It's not the cleanest, necessarily. It overdrives at a certain point, but it's probably, I would venture, I don't have an official statistic on this, but my guess would be, based on the amount of players who have played it and the amount of studios it's in and gigs that it's in and everything, it's probably one of the most, if not the most, recorded clean amp of all time. And honestly, when you get to a certain point, saying which amp is cleaner, it's almost like comparing whether or not Professor Xavier or Mr. Clean has a balder head, right? You're kind of like, does it really matter at a certain point? So now I want to give you some great cleans with the Telecaster on the neck pickup, as well as the 345 for just a really, really pretty clean tone. And then I'm going to do some bluesy stuff. We're going to use a tube screamer, and for that I'm using a Maxon Apex 808, which is a great tube screamer, with this guitar. And then I'm going to do a vintage style blues thing with the ES-345, where you pull a lot of the bass and add a little bit more reverb. Some of you who've watched my channel know that I've done this before on other amplifiers, but by pulling the bass and adding some reverb, you just get a really cool vintage style blues tone, and that works great with a 345. Really exudes B.B. King. Another great blues player from back in the day who used the Twin Reverb was Michael Bloomfield. A tone in the similar realm. It's not a Michael Bloomfield tone, but it's kind of in that camp, in that vein. So we're going to hear some more cleans and some great bluesy tones. So let's check that out now. Now, I mentioned pedals. One of the things about it is it's not actually, in my opinion, the best pedal platform in the world. It's not like it doesn't take pedals well, but one thing is, it's already got its onboard reverb and tremolo and everything. And of course, anything going into the front end of the amp with the reverb, if you have a twin reverb, you want to use the reverb. I don't really know of many players who get a twin and just like, it's just like that reverb is so alluring. Of course, having that reverb and then putting a pedal into it is, it does not have an effects loop, so that kind of changes up your game a little bit. It does kind of similar to a Super or a Deluxe. It does have a sort of a glassy response. Now, I think there's a bit more depth to it than some of the other amps, and again, because it's, it's so high in wattage and it's so just big and powerful and wide sounding that the glassiness doesn't overpower it like it would with some amplifiers, but you do have to be careful with your overdrives or distortions and things still, because they sort of sit on top more rather than sink in. You're really going into a totally clean amp, and that, there's a lot of pedals that really just love going into an already partially overdriven amp. So there's things you can do with stacking pedals. There's certain things you can do, this and that and this, but generally speaking, I think you're best off with a clone style pedal for humbuckers and a tube screamer style pedal for single coils. Those are my two favorites for this type of amp. They suit the sound, I think. I like it with the bass and the treble at 5, the mids at 7, and going into the low gain input. That's the way that I like this amp for the most part. I think it works for a lot of different guitars, maybe, some little tweaks here and there. And it's another one like the Deluxe Reverb. You get a little bit more sag. If you just back your volume off to like 9, not a ton, so you're not losing a ton, but just that tiny little notch makes a big difference in responsiveness. But those kinds of tricks aside, and of course, set up the EQ the way that works for you. There are some limits there, like you can't push the bass too much, or it'll get too boomy. You can't push the treble too much, or it'll get too bright. But I found right in the middle there, it just loves guitars, and it makes them sound the way that they should sound. Now, we talked about the reverb and the tremolo, so we're going to close out with some great luscious reverb and tremolo, and for that I'm going to use my Gretsch 6120. I'm going to play at first with some just really rich reverb, and then also kick on the tremolo for another part so that you can hear again just how expansive and wide, and it has a depth to it, and again a wideness, but it also has that classic springy kind of thing. The Fender Black and Silverface series in general, I think, have the reverbs to judge all other reverbs by. That's my personal opinion, but having the Twin before has definitely made me way more judgmental about amps' reverbs. And they're like, this one has spring reverb, and you plug in and you go, that's not spring reverb. That doesn't take this away. It's just that kind of, you get used to the spring reverb in this, and it's hard to get used to the spring reverb in other amps that just don't match up. There's something about these that just, it's just so luscious and great. So we're going to close out with a couple of tones here using the Gretsch and using some of the effects on the Twin Reverb. Let us know in the comments, are you a Twin Reverb player? Do you want to be? Have you had the similar experience with it just kind of sitting around because they're so heavy and then favoring other amps? What is it about them? I don't know. I'm so glad that I came back to it, though, and I can tell you that this one is going to stick with me as long as I can possibly keep my hands on it. So enjoy these last few tones. Let us know what your Twin Reverb story is in the comments. Please remember to follow the link below where you can listen to some music. I'm Jack Fossett. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy the rest of the video.
Mm-hmm.